Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest Dispatch from the Front. Story today from Bloomberg by Jenny Serrain. Citigroup to resume job cuts after pausing for pandemic. Citigroup Inc. will resume job cuts starting this week, joining rivals such as Wells Fargo in ending an earlier pledge to pause staff reductions during the coronavirus pandemic. The reductions will affect less than 1% of the bank's global workforce, the company said Monday in a statement. With recent hiring, overall headcount probably won't decline, Citigroup said. Citigroup is facing a likely revenue drop and another increase to loan loss reserves this quarter as the pandemic drags on, as well as years of expenses to improve risk controls. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve are weighing public reprimands of the firm because of continued deficiencies in infrastructure and control functions, people familiar with the matter said Monday. The decision to eliminate even a single colleague role is very difficult, especially during these challenging times, Citigroup said in the statement. We will do our best to support each person, including offering the ability to apply for open roles in other parts of the firm and provide severance packages. The bank says it has hired more than 26,000 people this year, and over one-third of those jobs were in the U.S. The lender had roughly 204,000 employees at the end of the second quarter. Some U.S. banks have resumed job cuts in recent weeks after pledging en masse to pause such actions earlier this year. European firms, including HSBC Holdings plc and Deutsche Bank AG, had restarted reductions in May and June after also delaying. The pandemic's continued weight on the economy is threatening lenders with higher credit costs and crimping revenue growth. Chief Financial Officer Mark Mason said Monday that the bank is hoping to keep expenses flat to slightly up this quarter, as persistently low interest rates and a slowdown in consumer spending have weighed on the bank's results. While revenue from fixed income and equities trading is likely to climb up by a percentage in the low double digits in the third quarter, firm-wide revenue will probably still fall, Mason said. The lender will also likely have to set aside more in reserves to cover potential losses in the third quarter. Citigroup dropped 4.3% to 46.09 at 9:55 a.m. in the New York trading. The firm's shares dropped 5.6% yesterday, the worst performance in the 66-company S&P Financials Index after Mason's comments and the report of potential regulatory actions. It marked the stock's worst two-day decline since June. The bank has been investing more in improving infrastructure and control functions after spending roughly $1 billion on such efforts this year. It is in discussions with the Fed and OCC over improving those functions, the people said. While we never comment on our discussions with regulators, we are completely committed to improving our risk and control environment, Citigroup said in a separate statement on Monday. We recognize that we are not there yet. We're not yet where we need to be, and that has to change. We have thus redoubled our efforts and have made improving our risk and control environment a strategic priority. Still, the looming regulatory hurdle accelerated the timing of Chief Executive Officer Michael Corbett's announcement that he would step down next year. Corbett wanted fresh leadership installed ahead of announcing what could be a years-long remediation process to satisfy regulators, according to the people. The bank will offset investments in better governance with plans to reduce its real estate footprint and by moving some employees to less expensive cities and offices. I cannot emphasize enough there is no greater priority for the entire management team than getting to what we would characterize as a best-in-class risk and control environment, Mason said. All right, so let us first expand a little bit on some of the issues in the story for folks that may not be aware of the history, and then let's look at it through our lens of values and culture. First off, you have to remember that this risk and controls discussion is not a new one. In the run-up to the financial crisis in 2008, most banks were heavily pursuing what was referred to as Basel II. Basel II was an attempt to reduce bank reserves based on a proven ability to manage risk. So the thinking was, hey, we've gotten more sophisticated in how we manage risk. We've gotten much better information and predictive analytics around risk. Therefore, with risk being lower, our reserves should be lower as well. So Basel II was an attempt to get regulators to buy off on that notion. And Basel II ran into the buzzsaw of the financial crisis because all these people claiming that we were managing risk well failed to predict the mortgage crisis and the ensuing credit crunch. So how well were we really managing risk? The answer is not enough. And I can tell you that before the financial crisis, risk was not a priority at many a bank, including the one that I worked at. In fact, I had an interaction with an executive at the bank when I was coming over to help him with some of the risk issues that we were having. And he pointed out to me that he'd been looking at dashboards for months since assuming his role, and they were all flaming green right up until we drove it into the ditch in the financial crisis. And why was that? It's because we weren't really managing risk. The emphasis was on managing bonuses. Because you see, the bonuses for these executives, which are quite substantial, a bonus at the executive ranks of a bank is often equal to or in excess of their annual salary. It's quite lucrative. And so you want to make your bonus pretty much no matter what. And executives who find it difficult to make their bonus are often tempted to make it no matter what. This is where you get the ethics crises that keep cropping up at various banks. So Citigroup, which, by the way, is a bank which is well known for being a parking place for out-of-office Democrats, Citigroup has had more than its share of issues dragging its feet with risk management. Why? Because those self-same Democrats are there for one reason and one reason only, to make as much cash as possible before resuming their political careers. And you can bet they are going to get their bonus. Now, politicians are not well known for their loyalty to their organization or to integrity. They will do whatever it takes to line their own pockets and increase their own power. And that is what happens when you have Democrat politicians as executives at Citigroup. They have next to no banking knowledge. They are there to be figureheads and cash in. Now, what does Citigroup get for this? Well, a number of those people on the board and in positions of influence at Citigroup are likewise strongly tied to the Democrat Party, so they expect paybacks from the Democrats. With regard to the regulators, they get an easier time from the regulator. Now, with Donald Trump in control and with some loyalists actually taking over positions in some of these regulatory agencies, Citigroup's free run has come to an end. It's a similar story with JP Morgan, which was always getting favorable treatment from the regulators. That run has pretty much come to an end. So now it's time to pay up. And just as the other banks have had to prove that they've had good, solid process controls in place to ensure compliance, now Citigroup is being required to do that. This is not a new requirement. This has been in place for 12 years now. Citigroup was simply being given a pass. They were looking the other way. Now, the other thing that you have to understand about this three-card Monte scheme that the federal government set up under Obama with the banks was that the banks don't really suffer from paying fines. The reason they don't suffer from paying fines is because the banks are now the primary buyers of the federal debt. China stopped buying quite some time ago, and the banks stepped up in response. They put these in a place that you can find if you go out to the St. Louis Fed website and you look up a chart that is called Excess Reserves of Depository Institutions. Remember how I told you that in the run-up to the financial crisis, the goal of Basel II was to cut the reserves. Well, after the financial crisis, we did just the opposite. The historical excess reserve, that's reserves on top of what is required by government, is zero until 2008, 2009. Why is that? It's because banks make money with money. So they don't want to keep reserves. They want to put that money out in the form of loans and make money. That's what they exist to do. And so the fact that in 2008, 2009, that jumped from zero to about $2.5 trillion across the banking sector will tell you how much risk they felt needed to be mitigated. Keep in mind that those excess reserves are in the form of government bonds for debt. And now you start to get a picture of how the federal government has been going on a spending spree without inflation being a significant factor. That money is being held in banks and also in corporations. There was about another $1.5 trillion back during the crisis that was being held in excess reserves for big corporations. So you've got a big dam behind which is a crap ton of money. As I said, during the financial crisis, that was about $4 trillion total. That's on a $15 trillion economy. So you can imagine what happens if all of a sudden the amount of money circulating in the economy were to go up by 25% in a year. You would have 25% inflation, right? The buying power of that money would drop by the same amount. We have not had 25% inflation in a year. The reason is because the banks are keeping in those reserves. And then what happens is when the federal government comes down to fine the banks, how do you think they pay the fine? They pay it out of those reserves. In fact, we were starting to see that those levels come down before this pandemic struck. And it was about, I think the last time I looked at it, it was down from 2.5 to about 1.5 trillion in the excess reserves of depository institutions. And then it started climbing back. Again, go out to the St. Louis Fed site. It's public information. The graph you're looking for is excess reserves of depository institutions. If you want to see the corporate side of that, excess reserves of non-depository institutions, and you'll get a feel for what actually is going on here. So now the regulators are tightening the screws on Citigroup. Citigroup is just going to dip into their portion of that money. They will pay the fine. Do you really think that they're going to change the way that they approach risk? No. I'll tell you how you know they're not going to change the way they approach risk, because they're having layoffs that are net negative. So if you're going to lay off 1% of the workforce, they're not hiring the people that they need in order to improve those risk controls. Now, you could argue perhaps they did that earlier in the year. They got a wind of this, and then they started working on it. I doubt they did. This is an election year. I guarantee you that all the Democrat hacks over at Citigroup are convinced that they're going to cheat their way to victory and that they'll never have to take action on this. And so they're going to delay that decision. They're not going to staff up with a bunch of risk people because they don't believe they're going to need them. They think they're going to get away with it because they think that creepy Joe Biden is going to be dragged across the finish line by Kamala Harris and the rest, and they will never, ever have to pay this penalty. That's what's really going on in this story. Now, what does it say about values and company values on here? Number one, Citigroup does not value risk. They simply don't. If you can find any evidence that they've effectively managed risk, please do let me know. I would be so intrigued by that change in behavior. It would really be meaningful to me. What Citigroup will do is they will throw a big pile of cash at whatever short-term pain they have to deal with because of the risk. They are not known for being forward-looking, for being innovative. None of these things really applies to Citigroup. It's really more of a club than it is a bank. And I think that comes out in their response to this. So they'll put together press releases. They'll say some things. But will you see their actual behavior change? Will you see them, for example, divesting themselves of loans and mortgages that are looking kind of bad? No. They talk in here about reducing their real estate footprint, right? Well, I think they're talking about the company's personal real estate. By that I mean assets that are on their books, not real estate loans, The fact of the matter is that because so many people are working virtual, they are realizing that we have much more corporate real estate than we need. Add to that some of the corporate real estate out there has been burned or damaged by rioters, again, driven by the folks, at Citigroup. I'm sure they've contributed plenty of money to Black Lives Matters and other George Soros front groups so that they can continue their path to the White House, if you will. But the fact of the matter is that when you have things like that happen, property values drop. Who wants to buy or rent space in a building which has been on fire? You don't. Citigroup has a disproportionate impact in New York City since it's kind of a New York-based bank. It's very strongly regarded as a brand with New York City. And what's New York City doing with regard to buildings and real estate? Everybody's fleeing the city. So the combination of the riots and the damage that they cause with the fact that people are fleeing, and when they're fleeing, guess what? They're not renting anything. They're getting out of those rents. It's really putting consumer real estate flat on its back. Now, bankers have predicted for a number of years and for a variety of reasons that consumer real estate was a bubble that was about to burst. I guarantee you that the people at Citigroup are still profiteering off of those rents to the extent that they can, and they don't want the gravy train to end, so they're going to hold on to consumer real estate way too long, and they're going to wind up eating losses as a result. Why? Because somebody over there gets paid their bonus based on how much CRE they have, and they're going to want to preserve that bonus until it absolutely collapses. I think that's the pattern of behavior you're going to see. Whereas other banks have come to realize that CRE is a dog and it's going to be a problem, and they're divesting of it. You'll see the same thing with regard to the mortgage businesses, and that default mortgages are continuing to grow. And so we learned out of the crisis that you really need to keep an eye on your default mortgage rate, because a little bit of degradation in that rate causes an enormous amount of pain to the institution. It historically was a very stable business, but it has become less so since the crisis. And so at the first sign of increase in mortgage default rates, your banks that are in the mortgage business should be taking swift and effective action to get rid of the risk. And that means I start to see that loan go, I'm going to look for somebody to take it on. Oh, here comes Fannie and Freddie again. Same crap that they did last crisis, because, again, that tends to be a place that Democrat politicians go to mark time and cash in. And Fannie and Freddie want to be on the lower end of the housing market, and they get offended when banks actually make those loans. And so they come running along, griping about the market share that they need in order to justify their bonuses. And, oh, we already have a bunch of loans that look like they could be dogs packaged up and ready for you to take. Please take them. You can see this whole pattern bearing out again, hopefully on a smaller scale than it did back in 2008. But you can bet that there's going to be more issues in housing. You also have to contend with the fact that so many people are fleeing Democrat-run states that housing values are going to change, right? They're going to drive them up in red states where they're going, and they're going to collapse in blue states. What's going to happen when they collapse? You're going to wind up with a bunch of underwater homes, in the sense that they owe more on the mortgage than the house is worth because nobody's moving to blue states. And as a result, you're going to see more defaults. It's going to happen just like clockwork, take it to the bank, so to speak. Okay, so that's what's going on with all this. I think what's necessary coming out of this is that banks need to really check themselves. They are still engaged in some of the practices, some of the bonus padding nonsense that got us into so much trouble back about 10, 12 years ago. Focus on the customers, focus on the need, focus on good, strong underwriting in order to reduce your risk. focus on the verification of income, especially now with so many folks unemployed. I happened to refi my house to get a lower payment, thankfully, just before becoming unemployed. That helped. My payment's a couple $100 lower a month. It's still difficult to make a mortgage payment when you're unemployed, but we staved off the risk of a foreclosure longer as a result of that. So hopefully we planned it right, and then as things start to come back, as I start to get more income coming in, we'll be right back with no blip. And the only thing it cost me was, I suppose I could have lowered the term a little bit or done something else preferable, just simply getting the rate down. But with mortgage rates at their lowest level in a generation, you felt like you had to do something. So in the wake of all that, I hope that many of you were able to take advantage of those lower mortgage rates and to put yourself in a better financial position for this mess. And that continues to bear out in the future. It would be nice if banks would kind of wake up and start doing things that were more helpful to people, so that over the long term, the economy would recover better, and therefore the gravy train could start up again. Instead, I think we're going to see short-term thinking on the part of bankers. That's what they're known for. And folks like Citigroup will continue to appear in the news because they do stupid things and keep thinking that they're smarter than the people that are out there to catch them. That's all I've got for today. Have a great day.